where there's no end in sight to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In the aggressor's latest move, President Vladimir Putin has announced that Moscow will annex 4 occupied regions of Ukraine. The move has been widely condemned by the international community. To help us understand what this means, I'm now joined by international relations specialist Mbekezeli Mkhize. Kabazela, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. I'll take the words of NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, who accuses Russian President Vladimir Putin of provoking the most serious escalation of the war in Ukraine since it began in this latest action. This illegal annexation of more Ukrainian territory by Russia, what exactly are its implications?
Good morning with your viewer. Good evening to you and your viewers, and thanks for having me. In fact, this is quite an interesting and very intriguing development, what is happening in this conflict. In fact, it has entered in it's more than 200 days now since this thing has been going on. But what we've seen, this annexation now, it shows that we've now changed, the conflict has now changed the gear, and it shows the level of determination on the side of Russia to say these territories, in fact, used to be ours, and we could do all it takes to protect what used to be ours. You would remember that in terms of Russia, they don't see Ukraine as an independent state. So it's not surprising that they are annexing these regions. But this annexation in particular follows the referendum, which is, as we all know, which is disputed, where pro-Russian, where most of these regions voted in favor of Moscow, coming back to Moscow, implying that these 4 regions are now incorporated to Russia. So meaning the pro-Western allies are not happy with this movement. You wouldn't be surprised with the NATO chief pronouncing that what the Russians are doing is in direct contravention of the international law. We all know that to Putin in particular, Ukraine and Russia have always been one nation. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia. And with this development that you've just highlighted, it's making a huge impact on the conflict. You would recall that most of the schools in Ukraine are now told to change their curriculum to the Russian one. And we've also seen the ruble trying to replace the Ukrainian currency. I think, in my view, it's really putting a lot of pressure now on the Russians, because for as long as this conflict carries on, you will notice that the West, being led by the US and its allies, is willing to supply Ukraine with more funding and with more arms. And what they've done also, that we should also remember, is when they imposed sanctions to Moscow. And those sanctions, to be honest with you, are having a negative impact on Russia. It's like trying to say, how will Russia carry on financing this war, which is becoming extremely expensive on their side? And the other aspect that we should also take into account is the fact that the Russians have always wanted to be treated as equal partners with the United States. But you should also recall that although the pro-Western allies are now encroaching on what used to be Russia's territory, the Russians are not willing to just give up what used to belong to them. Since you remember that the Ukraine and Russia, I mean, after the fall of the Cold War, then the two countries split in 1991.
Right.
Which to Russia is not, it was seen as abnormal, because to them this used to be their territory. And while the West is also imposing sanctions, the West itself is also disintegrating. You saw Britain leaving the EU, which they've been part of it for 47 years. So these developments, to me, are having a huge impact in terms of the international global order or disorder that we are seeing.
Of course, this also comes as President Putin also mobilized hundreds of thousands of more troops and also engaged in what is simply described as an irresponsible nuclear saber rattling. And now this.
Yes.
What do you make of this escalation since the start of the war, and how's the response been from the global bodies and countries that are watching this war very closely?
Of course, the response has been very negative on the side of the West. You've seen Prime Minister of Britain lambasting Russians' actions. You've seen Joe Biden lambasting the actions, saying that what Moscow is doing is in fact a contravention of the international law. And you must also remember that what Moscow is doing, like I indicated, it's not like trying to accept defeat, because, and you should also remember that some of these regions, they also speak Russian, some of the people in these regions. So there is cultural linkages, ethnic linkages that we cannot avoid, that these people, I mean, they themselves have always, some of them have always been wanting to go back to Moscow. And what is also particularly interesting is that with the change of leadership on the Ukrainian side, you remember in 2013 when there were protests, because President Viktor Yakunov didn't want to join the EU, and then he was adamant, saying, I don't want to be part of the EU. With this Zelensky now, he wants the EU, he wants to be a member of the EU as of yesterday. He's willing to join. And now that at some point the Russians, remember when they lost the superpower status after 1991, then the West wanted to dominate the global politics. Then the Russians said, no, we can't let them do this. And when in 2000, you remember when Russia regained its power because of oil prices that went up. Remember, it's one of the third largest oil-producing countries, gas-producing countries. So with those sales of oil, and then it regained its superpower status. Then now, as far as it's concerned, it's able to now confront the West, because the West is, in Putin's view, is encroaching in the land that is rightfully his. That is what his view of all of these things, to say the West is now using NATO and the EU to encroach in my territory. Because as far as he's concerned, he never recognized Ukraine as a sovereign state since its birth after the 90s.
Of course, those referendums engineered in Moscow and imposed on Ukraine are seen to be a total violation of international law. That was Mbekezeli Mkhize. He's an international relations specialist, giving us a bit more about the situation playing out in Ukraine. Coming